Hi, welcome to Lecture 2 in Week 2 of the Sociology of Work and Technology, Fall 2021. Alright, so in the last video we talked a little bit about Smith's idea of the division of labor, how that could result in kind of heightened productivity and profitability for capitalists, right? And then I talked a little bit about how bureaucracy basically takes that idea of a division of labor and kind of codifies it, making it so that there are rules that govern each kind of procedure and position in an organization, and arranges them often in a hierarchical arrangement, meaning that there's one person at the top, and then different layers of managers and supervisors and so on and so forth, all the way down to like just a bunch of employees, right? And this is how lots of organizations are run to this day, although, as we'll talk about later on, it's not sort of the cutting edge of capitalism as it was, say, 100 or 150 years ago. Smith says that the work processes are arranged this way to ensure profitability, and that profitability, is better for society at large, right? Basically, a rising tide lifts all ships is kind of Smith's argument. Now, in contrast, what Marx says is that, and this is, for those of you who are familiar with his writing, probably heard this before, but basically he sees workers and capitalists, or workers and their bosses, as in conflict, right? And so the manager or capitalist needs to basically ensure that workers supply their maximum labor power during a set period of time for a set payment, right? This is, and whereas like workers want to work as little as they can during that same period of time to get the same amount of money, right? This is kind of a fundamental antagonism that Marx sees, and we could say, well, is that really the case? We could be critical of this. Well, is that really the case? And maybe that's something we could discuss in the Q&A. So basically Marx is saying, okay, labor power, which is something that's embodied in humans, right? You can't just purchase labor power off a shelf. You need to hire a human being who can provide their labor power. So labor power is always embodied in people. Labor power is one of several commodities that's used by capitalists to produce whatever it is that they produce. These are these commodities that they use to produce whatever it is that they produce are what Marx calls the factors of production. And these include technologies and raw materials, as well as labor or labor power. Now, among these factors of production, like I said, labor power is unique. Why? It's always embodied in a person, and it's not as easily used up as other kinds of commodities, right? If I buy a jug of water and you need a whole liter of water, say, to produce, a few loaves of bread, right? You need a liter of water, you need, a couple kilograms of flour, you need, you use those all up, and you get 3 or 4 loaves of bread. Now at the end of that process, the flour and the water, they're bread. They're used up and they've become bread. But the labor power embodied in a human being, the baker or whatever, doesn't become bread. They're not used up. They're still there, right? And if you gave them more flour and water, they could make more, right? And so like if you hire a worker for a set period of time, say 8 hours a day, and as long as you keep on giving them the other supplies, the flour and water and yeast and whatever salt, that you use to make bread, they can keep on making bread, and they're not entirely used up in that process. Moreover, the amount that you have to pay for that amount of time is actually less than the cost of the amount of work that they can do in that time. Let's say you get paid $15 an hour and you can produce 10 loaves of bread in that hour. Let's say the ingredients for each loaf is about $3. So that's $30 for the ingredients, right? That's $15 for your labor, which is a total of $45. But let's say each of those loaves can be sold for $7. Well then, the capitalist who's invested his money in buying all these commodities, the flour, the salt, the water, the labor power, can make something like $25 per loaf, or $25 rather per hour, not per loaf, in excess of what they paid for, right? And so your labor has produced a surplus. $15 for labor has produced $25 in profit. And that is how money becomes, capital, if you go on to read Marx. But that difference there is the surplus value of labor. And you can go on working. You're not used up in that 1 hour of work. And you can go on to produce, 10 loaves of bread every hour, right? And you're making a potential profit of $25 for the organization every time. So this is what he's saying. So he's saying that what this does is this creates kind of a conflict of interests, or a potential conflict of interest, in which workers want to work. I don't know about you, but I want to put in the least amount of effort and get the most pay. Now, that's not to say that we're lazy. It's just to say that we're efficient in our, we want to be efficient in our use of our resources of time and effort. So why put in a lot of effort if you're not getting paid that much? And so, for Marx and Marxist scholars like Braverman, big question, and this was brought up in your reading from last week, big question is how is it that you control labor, right? And I think for Marxist scholars, or just critical scholars, people who care about power and don't want to just kind of be like, oh, that's the way the world is, I guess it's best to do what the boss tells us. People who actually want to be critical of the world and think through it. And that, being critical doesn't necessarily just mean being negative. It just means actually thinking through what's going on and being able to think critically about it, to ask a question why is it organized this way? Whose interests does this organization of work serve? Does it serve my own? And if so, great. And if not, then why am I participating in it, right? Just to ask those kinds of questions. Anyway, people who think critically about work basically, pose the question, well, how is it that, why is it that people go along with what their boss tells them to do, if this is what's going on, right? If we presume what Marx is describing to be accurate, then why is it that people go along with that? It's a perennial question. For capitalists, the question is how do we get people to do what we tell them? But for, I think, people who are a little bit more critical, it's well, why do they go along with it? And some strategies for controlling or exerting power over labor include, physical coercion or simple oversight by managers. And you might remember from last week's reading, if we go back 150 years, it used to be that business owners could have you locked up for refusing to do work, or if you were considered to be lazy on the job, they could put you in jail. In certain circumstances, early oil drilling and stuff like that. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie. It's quite old at this point, right? It's 10 or 15 years old. There Will Be Blood, but people would just shoot their employees for insubordination. This is something that happened, right? So that's what I mean by physical coercion. And there's that, or there's just like simple oversight by managers with just like people just saying like, hey, you gotta step it up, right? And this could be violent at times, or it could be something akin to what we're used to experiencing today. There's also technical control, which is sort of a conveyor belt assembly line that regulates how fast workers assemble things. Or bureaucratic control, so elaborate kind of indifferent rules and hierarchy, as described by Weber. Taylorism is a particular version of this, wherein movements, processes, interactions are all centrally planned or scripted by managers. This happens in the factories that are described by Taylor and Braverman, but also can be found in customer service representatives' interactions with customers, or even fast food workers. Anyone who's ever worked in a place where you have to follow very specific procedures and particular kinds of motions, and everything is kind of heavily regimented, is experiencing some kind of scientific management often. Then there's also ideological or kind of cultural control mechanisms, and affective control mechanisms, wherein wherein bosses or management attempts to shape how people feel at the level of kind of sensation, like making you feel kind of pleasant or good in order to get more out of you. Anyway, so scientific management, which is sometimes called Taylorism, often called Taylorism, basically takes the division of labor that is described by Smith and kind of ratchets it up a notch and breaks down work into component motions. Not just breaking it down to tasks, which is what Smith is describing, but the actual movements of the body. And saying you have to move in very particular ways in order to increase efficiency and ostensibly safety. So this is what he says. But it's also aimed at increasing speed and replicability so that it can be the same every time. Right? When you're mass manufacturing objects, you do want something to be the same every time, right? You do want it to be as fast as possible in order to get more out of more labor power out of your workers for the same pay. And then, also to increase safety, right? A lot of the work that's being described by Taylor is quite backbreaking work, very hard. So, there is the idea you don't want, if you purchased your labor power for the day, you're paying your workers, you don't want them to get injured, because you might be responsible for it in terms of the law. But if we go back 100 years, things were way less regulated than they are now. The only reason we have labor protections is from labor movements, and unions being a big part of those things. I'm getting ahead of myself here. But you also don't want your commodity that you purchased, your labor power, to get damaged, right? You want it to maintain peak performance. And this leads Braverman to say, well, the preconception of the process. That before it's set in motion, the visualization of each worker's activities before they've actually begun, the time it will consume, the control and checking of the ongoing process once it's underway, and the assessment of results upon completion of each stage of the process. All of these aspects of production have been removed from the shop floor to the management office, which is saying that the kind of control or autonomy over work that we see in craft production. And you can see this in the video Nails that I assigned. That kind of autonomy is deliberately removed from work in order to exert more control over workers and to capture more surplus value. And you can see this quite clearly in a short excerpt that I want to conclude with that's just a few minutes long. From a film on food service employees. Notice in the film how they describe how to assemble a hamburger.
Section of the videotape will cover your appearance and the front line. Your responsibility to our customers actually begins before you even arrive at the restaurant. Make sure your uniform is neat and clean and that you're in the proper uniform as outlined in the employee handbook. Remember, you are druthers.
Enthusiasm. Enthusiasm is so important. For managers to be enthusiastic in their business is tremendously important. If you go into work this morning and somebody says, well, good morning, how are you? And you say, well, I'm wonderful, thanks. You feel different than if you go into work this morning and somebody doesn't acknowledge you. And that's what we call paying mental wages. Well, heck, he loves me. He loves me already. It creates a relationship that is just chock full of loyalty.
I think in the training aid, it's really laid out in a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5-step procedure.
Can you give me an example?
Yeah, we can show you a video.
Or well, for the camera, how about the like the color transparency that shows here step by step how you put together deluxe quarter.
Great. What difference does it make whether the lettuce is on top of the cheese or...
It affects a couple of things. One is it actually affects what you taste. If you dress a sandwich and then you turn it over and take a bite of it, it'll taste a little different than if you hold it right side up. And the other thing is just simply consistency. If we're going to have a product that a customer believes that they like, then it's very useful for the product to be the same every time they get it. So in some cases, it just boils down to something as simple as, let's make it the same way every time, so that we're not reinventing how to dress a deluxe quarter back there with every single employee every single day.
I'm just wondering if you're looking for a different kind of worker in a way than you would have been in one of the old style restaurants.
You're not looking for creativity as much. No, you're looking for somebody that would be, I would think,
That would be more content with following the procedures and the practices and getting their sense of achievement from an area other than being creative about it.
ideally though, it'd be great if all employees. Well,
It would be ideal if all employees related to some management qualities, but then, well, obviously what we need is some leaders and some followers.
All right, well, in the next week, we're going to talk about some of these same issues, control, power over work, and we're going to talk about how capitalist organizations sow divisions among workers as one of these strategies for controlling labor. And one of these divisions that capitalist organizations have historically kind of sought to create is along lines of race. Right? Basically creating a cleavage among workers, a division among workers who might otherwise have a common set of interests as a class. Likewise, gender also forms part of some contemporary systems of control, most often playing a part in techniques that center on ideological control, right? Ideas about gender being used to get more out of workers, and we're going to see that next week as well. With that in mind, I'll see you Wednesday.